It was you. You were the reason he has this company. You were the brain behind the whole thing, and they erased you from the story." These words hit me like a punch to the chest. After 26 years of being invisible in my own family, someone finally saw me. But it wasn't who I expected. It was my brother's fiancée, and what she revealed that night changed everything I thought I knew about my life. My name is Sophia, and I'm 26 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've been the shadow in my family's story. While my older brother Edward was the golden child, the star athlete, the charming one, the successful entrepreneur, I was just there. The quiet one. The one who tried too hard. The one who somehow never quite measured up. Growing up, I learned to make myself small. When Edward scored the winning touchdown, I cheered from the sidelines. When he got accepted to his dream college, I helped him write his essays. When he started his tech company at 24, I was the one researching market trends at 2 a.m., sending him detailed reports that he'd glance at and say, "Thanks, sophomore." My parents would light up when Edward walked into a room. Their faces would literally change, from polite interest to pure joy. With me, it was different. I got the obligatory "How was your day?" followed by a quick change of subject to whatever Edward was doing. I used to think maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining the difference in how they treated us. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was the afterthought. The spare. The one who existed to make everyone else's life easier. For 3 years, I worked as a freelance data analyst from my tiny apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but I was good at it. Really good. I could spot market trends, analyze consumer behavior, and predict business outcomes with scary accuracy. But nobody in my family seemed to notice or care. Meanwhile, Edward's company was thriving. TechFlow Solutions had become the talk of the town, a revolutionary platform that helped small businesses optimize their operations. Every family dinner became a celebration of Edward's latest success. New clients, bigger contracts, media interviews. My parents couldn't stop bragging about their entrepreneurial son. What they didn't know was that I was the one feeding Edward the insights that made his company successful. Every week, I'd send him detailed market analyses, competitor research, and strategic recommendations. I'd spend hours crafting proposals for his biggest clients, analyzing their pain points, and suggesting solutions. Edward would take my work, present it as his own, and watch his business soar. I told myself I was just being a supportive sister. That family helped family. But watching him accept awards and give interviews about his innovative approach while I remained invisible was slowly eating away at me. The worst part wasn't just being ignored, it was being actively dismissed. Last Christmas, when I mentioned my own work at dinner, my father actually laughed. Data analysis, Sophia? That's not a real career. You should find something more stable. Look at your brother, now that's success. I remember excusing myself to the bathroom that night and crying silently into my hands. I was 26 years old, and I felt like I was still waiting for my life to begin. 3 months ago, my parents invited us over for what they called a family celebration. Edward had just landed his biggest client yet, a Fortune 500 company that had signed $1 million contract. The whole family was there, my parents, my aunt and uncle, even my grandparents had driven down from Portland. Edward arrived with his fiancée, Mary. She was everything I wasn't, confident, outgoing, the kind of person who commanded attention without trying. She worked in marketing for a major firm, and she was brilliant. I'd always felt intimidated by her, but she'd always been kind to me in a way that felt genuine. The evening started like all our family gatherings did. Edward was the center of attention, regaling everyone with stories about his latest business triumph. My parents hung on his every word, beaming with pride. I sat quietly at the edge of the conversation, nursing my wine and trying to disappear into the background. "Tell them about the presentation, honey," Mary encouraged Edward. "The one that sealed the deal." Edward's face lit up. "Oh, that was brilliant. I had this incredible analysis of their market position, their competitors, their growth opportunities. The client said it was the most comprehensive business intelligence they'd ever seen." I felt my stomach drop. That analysis, I had written it. I'd spent 2 weeks researching their industry, analyzing their competitors, identifying their untapped markets. I'd sent Edward a 40-page report with detailed recommendations. He called me the next day to say, "Good job, sis," and that was it. "Edward has such a gift for understanding business," my mother gushed. "He's always been so analytical, so strategic." My father nodded. "That's what separates successful entrepreneurs from everyone else. The ability to see the big picture." I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and tell them exactly where that big picture analysis had come from. But I didn't. I never did. I just sat there, invisible as always, while they celebrated my work as Edward's genius. That's when Mary spoke up. At first, I thought she was just joining the praise. "The research really was incredible," she said, looking directly at Edward. "Those market insights, the competitive analysis, it was brilliant work." Edward smiled, basking in the attention. "Thank you, babe. I really put my heart into it." Mary's expression shifted slightly. Something flickered in her eyes, confusion, maybe? She glanced at me, then back at Edward. "Wait," she said slowly. "Didn't you tell me your sister helped with the research?" The room went quiet. Edward's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Well, Sophia did some basic data collection," he said dismissively. "But the analysis, the strategy, the insights, that was all me." Mary's frown deepened. She looked at me again, and I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen before when someone in my family looked at me. Recognition. Understanding. Basic data collection? Mary repeated. "Edward, that's not what you told me." The tension in the room was palpable. My parents were looking between Mary and Edward, confused. Edward was starting to look uncomfortable. "Mary, I think you're misremembering," he started. "No," Mary interrupted, her voice firm. "I'm not misremembering. You told me your sister was the one who wrote the entire analysis. You said she was a genius with data, that she could spot patterns no one else could see. You said she was the secret weapon behind your biggest deals." My heart was pounding. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Mary turned to face the family, her voice growing stronger. "You want to know the truth about that $1 million contract? About all of Edward's contracts? It wasn't Edward who wrote those analyses. It was Sophia. She's been the brain behind this entire company, and you've all been celebrating the wrong person." The silence that followed was deafening. "That's ridiculous," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sophia doesn't know anything about business." "Doesn't she?" Mary pulled out her phone. "Edward, should I show them the email you sent me last week? The one where you said, and I quote, 'I don't know what I'd do without Sophia's research. She's carrying this company.'" Edward had gone pale. "Mary, please. Or how about the time you told me you were stressed about the Henderson presentation, and I suggested you ask Sophia for help? You said, 'I don't need to ask her. She'll have the analysis ready before I even tell her what I need.'" My mother was staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time. Sophia? Is this true? I finally found my voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. I helped with some research. Some research? Mary's voice was incredulous. Sophia, you wrote every major analysis that built this company. Every market report, every competitive study, every strategic recommendation. You've been doing this for 3 years. But why? My aunt asked, looking genuinely confused. Why would you do all that work and not take credit? The question hung in the air, and suddenly I felt 26 years of frustration and hurt bubbling up inside me. Why? Because I'd spent my entire life being told I wasn't good enough. Because I'd been conditioned to believe that supporting others was the only way I could be valuable. Because I'd been so desperate for my family's approval that I'd given away my own accomplishments. Because, I said, my voice getting stronger, I wanted to help. I wanted to be useful. I looked around the room at my family's shocked faces. I wanted someone to notice me. Edward finally spoke up. Sophia, I never meant for it to seem like. Like what? I stood up, and suddenly I couldn't stop the words from coming. Like you were taking credit for my work? Like you were building your entire career on my research? Like you were letting our family believe you were some kind of business genius while I was just the disappointing daughter who couldn't get her life together? That's not, Edward started. Yes, it is. I was shaking now, but I felt powerful for the first time in years. Do you know what it's like to watch your own brother accept awards for work you did? To listen to your parents brag about accomplishments that were yours? To be invisible in your own family? My mother looked stricken. Sophia, we never meant to make you feel invisible. But you did, I said, tears streaming down my face. You all did. Every family dinner, every celebration, every time you asked Edward about his business and looked right through me. I was there. I was always there, doing the work, making it possible, and none of you saw me. The room was silent except for my ragged breathing. I looked around at my family, really looked at them, and saw something I'd never seen before. Shame. Guilt. Recognition of the pain they'd caused. My father was the first to speak. Sophia, I had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked, I said simply. You never asked what I was working on. You never asked about my life. You never asked if I was okay. You just assumed I was fine being invisible. Mary reached out and touched my arm. You don't have to be invisible anymore. Looking at her, I realized she was right. I didn't have to be invisible. I'd been making myself small for so long that I'd forgotten I had a choice. I could speak up. I could take credit. I could stop giving my work away and start building something for myself. You're right, I said, wiping my eyes. I don't. I turned to Edward. I'm done. I'm done doing your research, writing your proposals, building your business. I'm done being your secret weapon. Edward looked panicked. Sophia, please. You need to figure it out yourself, I said. Like I've been doing my whole life. I looked at my parents. I love you both, but I can't keep pretending this is okay. I can't keep accepting scraps of attention while Edward gets the feast. I deserve better than that. My mother was crying now. We're so sorry, sweetheart. We never realized. I know, I said, and I meant it. But knowing and changing are two different things. The resolution, 55 to 60 minutes. I left that night with a clarity I'd never had before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about disappointing my family or not living up to their expectations. I was focused on living up to my own. The next morning, I started working on something I'd been thinking about for months, my own consulting firm. Using all the skills I'd developed over the years, all the expertise I'd hidden behind Edward's success, I began building something that was entirely mine. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I was making a mistake. But every time I felt that familiar urge to make myself small, I remembered Mary's words, "You don't have to be invisible anymore." My parents called several times in the weeks that followed. They wanted to make amends, to understand how they'd missed so much. The conversations were difficult but necessary. We talked about patterns that had been set in childhood, about unconscious bias and assumptions about success. It was painful, but it was also healing. Edward called too. He was struggling without my research, and he wanted to know if we could work together again. I told him I'd consider it if he wanted to hire my consulting firm and pay my professional rates. He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed. Mary and I became close friends through all of this. She told me later that she'd been watching the family dynamics for months, becoming increasingly uncomfortable with how I was treated. She'd tried to get Edward to give me credit several times, but he'd always brushed her off. Finally, she decided to take matters into her own hands. "I couldn't stand watching you disappear," she told me. "You're brilliant, Sophia. You deserve to be seen." The new beginning, 65 to 70 minutes. 6 months later, my consulting firm was thriving. I had my own clients, my own office, my own success. But more importantly, I had my own voice. I'd spent so many years being afraid to speak up, afraid to take up space, afraid to be seen. Now I was learning to do all of those things. The relationship with my family improved gradually. My parents made a real effort to understand my work and celebrate my accomplishments. They even came to the ribbon-cutting ceremony for my new office, beaming with pride as I spoke about my business. For the first time in my life, I was the center of their attention for something I'd built myself. Edward and I found a new dynamic too. He hired my firm for several projects, and our relationship became more professional and, surprisingly, more honest. He admitted that he'd always known I was the talent behind his success, but he'd been too proud and too scared to acknowledge it. We're still working on rebuilding trust, but we're getting there. Mary and Edward got married last month. In her maid of honor speech, she said something that made me cry, to Sophia, who taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone else find their voice. But the most important change was in how I saw myself. I'd spent my whole life believing I was the supporting character in everyone else's story. Now I understood that I was the main character in my own story, and I got to decide how it went. Looking back, I realized that being invisible wasn't something that happened to me, it was something I allowed to happen. I'd made myself small because I thought that was the only way to be loved, to be valuable, to belong. I'd given away my power because I didn't believe I deserved to have it. But here's what I learned: your family's inability to see your worth doesn't determine your worth. Their failure to celebrate your accomplishments doesn't make your accomplishments less real. Their love, conditional or not, doesn't define your value as a person. I spent 26 years waiting for my family to notice me, to appreciate me, to make me feel worthy. What I discovered was that I didn't need their validation to be worthy. I needed to validate myself. The hardest part wasn't confronting my family or starting my own business. The hardest part was learning to believe that I deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be celebrated. It was unlearning years of conditioning that told me I was only valuable when I was useful to others. Today, I run a successful consulting firm. I have clients who value my expertise and pay me well for it. I have a life that's entirely my own, built on my own terms. But more than that, I have something I never had before: self-respect. I'm not angry at my family anymore. I understand that families are complex, that parents make mistakes, that siblings can be thoughtless without meaning to be cruel. But I also understand that forgiveness doesn't mean accepting unacceptable behavior. It means choosing to move forward without carrying the weight of resentment. My relationship with my family is different now, but it's better. It's based on mutual respect rather than old patterns. They see me now, really see me, and I've learned to see myself too. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, I want you to know something: you are not invisible. You are not a supporting character. You are not responsible for making yourself small so others can feel big. Your voice matters. Your work matters. Your dreams matter. You don't need anyone's permission to take up space in this world. Maybe you're the one in your family who always helps but never gets helped. Maybe you're the one who cheers from the sidelines while others take the spotlight. Maybe you're the one who gives and gives and gives, hoping that someday someone will notice and appreciate what you've done. I'm here to tell you that you don't have to wait for that someday. You can start noticing yourself. You can start appreciating yourself. You can start building a life where you're not invisible anymore. It won't be easy. It will require courage, and there will be people who don't understand or support your decision to stop being invisible. But you deserve to be seen. You deserve to be celebrated. You deserve to be the main character in your own story. The question I want to leave you with is this: what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? What would you build if you stopped giving your power away? What would your life look like if you refused to be invisible? The answer to those questions is waiting for you. You just have to be brave enough to find it. And remember, sometimes the most important person who needs to see you is you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever watched someone else take credit for your work, your ideas, your contributions? What did you do about it? Share your story in the comments below. You never know who might need to hear that they're not alone.